And we will kick off the day with a karakia.
Thank you, Eke. Kia tau ngā manakatanga te mea ngaro, ki runga ki tuna, ki tēnā tātou, kia mākia e toa makihikihi, kia toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te aoha, toi te reo Māori, kia tuturu, kia whakamaua ki tina, haumie, let the strength and life force of ancestors be with each and every one of us, freeing our path from obstruction, so that the words, spiritual love and language held, permanently fixed, established, and understood for to be loved. We should be blessed now.
Yeah.
And morena, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome. This is day 2 of hearing number 4. And the first up submissions we have received today from the New Zealand Royal Forest and Bird Protection Society. Morena. So we've received in advance yesterday some legal submissions from yourselves, and you had somebody else with you?
Yes, so morning Commissioners, thank you for taking the time to hear from us today. So my name is Tim Williams, I'm the lawyer for Forest and Bird, and this is Dean Agent Mercer. He's our regional conservation manager, so on local and looks after our conservation efforts up in the Far North. So if you're happy for me to proceed in this way, then what I suggest is that we'll hear from Dean first. He's got a presentation which we'd like to share with you, and then once we've heard that, then I can talk to you about some of the more detail on the policies, and you'll have seen that I have sent in some legal submissions, so I'll take you through some of that. But ideally, we would like to encourage, to the extent that it's possible, some sort of a conversation to begin here, try to help you to understand our position on the important issues that you're considering. And the main one from our perspective really being SNAs. And we understand the position that the Council is taking, and that this is likely to be something that is going to take more time to land and resolve, but we are very keen to make sure that the position is protected in the meantime. So these sort of potential SNAs, let's say, that we have are protected in the interim as well as in the long term. So if there is to be a further process, then really we want to make sure that we do have some interim measures in place just to hold the line and protect those important areas.
Okay, well that sounds fine. We've allocated you 50 minutes, or 2 hours, I guess. Almost 2 hours for your presentation.
Well, that's what I don't think we will need all of that time.
I was going to say,
so thank you for that.
This is your time, and so welcome, and we want to feel free to present your evidence and your case how you wish, and if you don't mind, we might ask questions along the way. I don't think that's the invite you're giving to us.
Yes.
So we might ask questions along the way, and we'll see how we go. But we're just in your hands.
Thank you for that. So I'll hand over to Dean and show you this presentation.
Yeah, that should work. Do you want to just quickly test? Yep.
Okay, right.
Tēnā koutou katoa, Raurangi Tirama, awesome to be here. This is my first time in front of the hearing, so be gentle with me. I wanted to kind of give a background about the loss that we've had in the Far North District to give context to SNAs. So I want to start from outer space because we may as well. Aotearoa is a series of rocks in the middle of a vast ocean, and so there is a lot of life around us that comes to nest on land. And what used to be throughout all of the Far North were all sorts of seabirds, TT taipu, and they would spend their days at sea and then come into land. And it was the biggest cycle of bringing nutrients from the ocean to the land in a 24-hour cycle. So the land was constantly being fertilised. Now there's less than about 100 of these birds. And oi was the most common coastal bird. It would have been all around these cliffs here, all around the far north, a key food source. Definitely less than 100 birds left in the far north district. Inland, there were these birds, giant petrel, which were about this big. They now are only on Hotaru and Aotearoa. They used to be throughout all of the North Island. So these were the major birds. There were lots of smaller birds. Also, half of native birds are these seabirds. They only come to land to have nests. But that's a big nutrient cycle that is now gone from Aotearoa. They had burrows, like rabbits, and the sheep tuatara are also gone from the mainland. But there's a whole suite of birds that were in the far north district. This is one of the flightless wrens. There were about 7 of these in the place of mice, for example. They used to be everywhere up here, completely extinct. There were 3 or 4 types of ducks, some of them flightless, some of them not, also completely gone. Partially flighted birds, round birds with different length beaks, snipes, these have gone. We had 2, as far as we know, we had 2 species of moor up here, little bush moor and giant moor. The rainforest would have been dense and they would have been feeding and making their way through, but mainly in coastal and estuarine areas were more. The largest daytime predators on the ground, this is an adsbill, a metre high, would have been ripping apart those seabirds, completely extinct. This is the eagle, Wales eagle we would have had up here, a rainforest eagle. You can see it's twice the size of a kukupā, also gone. Come on, the last huia, of course, we just over 100 years ago, last seen Taurua Ranges. But there's places up here named after huia.
Oh, it is, it's just a bit slow, I think, to update on here. It's changed on my, you missed the other one.
Oh, yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah.
And so this is a photo I took in Wellington. This is a Te Papa, the bells of Te Papa. These are kakapo skulls that were collected in 1942 from Tokero Beach. Behind Tokero, there's dunes, there's these subfossil remnants. And kakapo would have been one of the most common forest birds in the far north. I prepared evidence for the Ngāpuhi hearings, and this is a little wee bit of it showing what has been wiped out and severely reduced by the introduction of different pest animals on top of those things, on top of the extinctions. But,
That one actually isn't missing mine. The little link's actually over here.
Oh,
there you go.
Okay. So this is the last native bird that went extinct. This bird would have been up here and got wiped out from the whole country and ended up on one last island. And this bird went extinct. There's only one photo of it. This is it, the year before I was born. And so it's due to people protecting habitats, doing pest control, doing lots of experiments, that we haven't had any extinctions of native birds during my lifetime. So in the context of the funnels, I want to show you what is left of the ancient ecosystems. Oops. Obviously, from mountains to sea, there was kauri forest. This got wiped out, mainly in different ways. The late 1800s, obviously, there was a massive, from 1845, there were some very strong pushes over in the Bay of Islands, but there were several waves of forest destruction. This photo is taken near Kaitaia in 1910, so this area has already been logged, and it's a secondary bird burning. And so what we end up with now is very little areas that have not been destroyed. So they are the main remaining forests in DOC and co governance arrangements now. And these are the ones that have not been logged and burnt. I mean, have been not burnt. They've nearly all been logged, except for that tiny area on top of Warawara and a small area on Puketi. So of the original ancient forest, there's nearly nothing left. Oh, good, it's doing amazing. In the 1980s, with Muldoon, when he took the subsidies off farming, a lot of Manuka and Kanuka have come back to the north, and so when you drive around, it's really green. But when we look at this, there's so little of the ancient forest left. So that's the context in which we inherit farm north. And if we look at wetlands, and I know the district council, it's a regional council responsibility, but forests are also wetland things too. So this is before human settlement, and this is what we've got now. So in terms of significant natural areas, anything that's left is of importance. And that's all about habitat loss. But then if we look at the arrival of possums, and the first Northland Advocate article about possums was in 1962, talking about their arrival in Manamuka, Te Kao, and Kaitaia. We've got possums late. So you can see here that they're not, well, you can see they're not there in the 1950s, but they are in the 1970s. There was a scheme, what's it called, a bounty scheme in 1951 for paying out on culling of possums, and it ran from 1951 to 61, and 8 million bounties were paid out. And so possums were south of Auckland at that stage, and what acted as an incentive for people to get a bounty and try and keep possums down in other parts of the country, acted as an incentive for people to bring them up here and release them. And I got the smoking gun from a farmer up near Kaitaia, Tony Schuster, and his neighbour, he would go down to Waikato to do possuming. He'd come back with the joeys in his car boot and release them. This was in the early 60s. So possums arrived at different times in different parts of the north. And so the country got overwhelmed. This is a collapse event that was happening in Whangaroa Harbour. I took the photo on the right in 2002. And so as possums invaded, the trees they most liked couldn't sustain their nibbling. And here's a close-up of a puhutaua. It was such an enormous tree. You can see maybe here, this laser it's not working. You can see some of the leaves bitten. Once a leaf gets bitten a few times, you can eat it back, and then there's a shoot that comes away with puhutaua. Next year, if that gets nibbled, that branch dies. And so in our lifetimes, we've been living through a collapse event. So we had the collapse of birds during the 80s. So we had kaka and kakariki go extinct in the north in the 80s, and kōkapa were thought to have gone completely extinct, and then they were rediscovered in Waimā Range in the early 1990s. But we've had this massive forest collapse of the actual trees. This is a tōtara behind Paihia, killed by possums in Kura State Forest, Northern Rata and Russell State Forest. That's photographed from a drone. That tree's probably 500 years old. And this is kind of a general hillside in the north of its forested. This is at Waikari, the ride's just down the road. But because possums kill trees at such a slow rate, people don't even notice. It just happens year after year, night after night. And you can see white dying trees. There are tōtara and there's pūriri in there. This is helicopter photo from 2018. I was with Kaumātua of Ngāti Hau. We went up to have a look at the damage of Russell State Forest before a 1080 operation, and all through 6,000 hectares this was happening, a massive tipping of tōtara through that whole forest.
No, yeah.
Oh, right.
It's fine.
Now, in terms of what we used to have is this is Taraire. Taraire is one of the big enablers of the forests of the north because it has fruit that are ripe now, but they can be ripe over 9 months. And so this enabled huge flocks of kukupa, keriru, over the north. There used to be 80 years ago flocks of 40 or 50 were normal, but that was the normal for that time. And before that, it was flocks of hundreds, and it would have been flocks of thousands, several hundred years before that. And Taraire is a canary in the mine shaft because possums eat their little new shoots, and those shoots don't become leaves, and then they don't become leaf litter. So the leaf litter gets thinner and thinner. And then when we get a drought event, so I'm going to move into the climate stuff now, of 2010, this is near Dargaville. Nearly all of the Taraire get wiped out. So that's taking out part of the food calendar for birds. So this is the impact of both pests on top of climate. And this is what happens. This is a Taraire 2 years after the last big drought we had in 2020. When they're wiped out, they fall apart, they melt away, and it's almost like they weren't even in there in the first place. It only takes a few years and they're completely gone. So we are now, and of course, so that's the attack from the top. That's the attack from the possums, and then we've got the attack from the bottom of the forest, from pigs, goats. This obviously isn't in the far north, but that illustrates that they can get almost anywhere. There are some coastal cliffs in Whangaroa a little bit like this, apparently. And there was actually a deer. Oh, maybe the deer is not there. Okay. And so we're now living in this time where our native forests used to be some of the best carbon sinks on land. Now, those forests are emitters if there's no pest control. So we have possums killing forests from the top and these other animals eating from below, preventing regeneration. And as the trees die and fall over, they start to rot and they give out carbon. So the remaining forest that we have, if there's no pest control, are emitters, not sinks. And so as the forests emit, they feed more climate change, which creates more droughts and flood, which have more impacts on the forests. So Cyclone Gabriel, ancient Northern Rata were tipped over at my place, I live at Ōmāpere, and then during the drought times, the Taraire and other species are going. And so there's obviously impacts on other species like kiwi. So as the ridges dry out, it pushes kiwi, can't get the backs into the ground, down further and further down the slope into the last remaining bits of water, streams and ponds and stuff. And that's also where the stoats and the cats and all the other introduced pest animals are pushed into in these drought times. So I want to talk about Cyclone Gabriel because in terms of what we have left, in terms of SNAs, we have the areas that are currently in DOC hands, and they may be under claim if they're in Ngāpuhi or they may be co-managed, co-governed in Te Roroa and Te Rānua or up in Ngāti. We have different management regimes so far for them, but around them there's often hapu land around the outsides which would be considered SNAs, and also private landowners like myself that manage to buy some bits of bush here and there. If they're falling apart, it means that we're also not protecting whatever is downstream, whether that's where people live, businesses and infrastructure. So this is a photo, one of my old schoolmates, she was tramping up in the Kauweka Ranges 3 days before Cyclone Gabriel. And you can, and this forest has had deer in it for 80 years at least, and you can see all of the slips happening. So there is beech forest there, it's holding the land together where it can. This is before Cyclone Gabriel. And where there was no trees, there was massive slippage, obviously, and you know what happened down in that way. So by looking after SNAs, we're going to be building the different levels of the forest beneath, so that when the rain comes, and I've noticed this year, I always take rain gauges. I have a very thorough record of the rain that's been happening over the past 5 or 6 years. And this year, things have changed. And when there's a prediction, it's usually, at least half the time, we're getting half or even 3 times as much rain as what is predicted. And it's coming down fast and hard, and the raindrops, this is what was predicted anyway, the raindrops themselves are getting bigger. And so we're in a time of kind of going to have more flash flooding type events. And when you've got a forest that's, or an SNA that's being looked after, and I'm working with Doc and with iwi and hapu on protecting these kind of large land rods, so that we can rebuild these different levels of the forest. So you have the canopy and the sub-canopy, and then the mosses and everything, so that when the rain does come down, it's got all that surface area to go through before it goes out the bottom. But if we're not looking after these areas, then we're exacerbating the effects of climate change. And also the sedimentation downstream. Now, I know that there were protests and a great upset about SNAs when they floated a few years ago, and part of that was because of the way that the district council had handled the whole process in terms of consultation and the lack of conversation that happened. And I completely understand why that had happened and why there was that reaction. And it will remain there controversial, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because we need to talk about things. Now, looking forward, people, in that context, people were seeing SNAs as a way of taking things from people and preventing things from happening. Looking forward, what we will soon be having is a regime where we will be able to get biodiversity credits and carbon credits. So there will be a way for people to make money, if you like, from areas that are protected, so long as the work is being done. And to give you an idea about, in terms of what can happen in terms of life coming back when you look after an area, this is a kohi tree over behind Pai here. That's keeping possums off it for 1 year. That's keeping possums off that same tree for 4 years. So in terms of carbon and the kind of money that people will be able to make, it's not so much taking people away, it's going to diversify the land use that is possible. So I'm working at a national level in forest and bird with NIWA and the other scientific bodies to come up with policy for the different political parties so that can be, that is an actual real working option for different private landowners, regardless of the different types of land ownership we have, whether it's communally owned hapu land or corporate owned farms or lifestyle blocks or whatever. We need to make things so that's really enabling. So this is, both areas of this fence are legally protected and are Q2 covenant. So in what's proposed in the district plan is to maintain biodiversity. But we're at a stage where there's such collapse, we are living through a time of absolute collapse that we need to enhance it. Maintaining isn't enough, and we can do enhancement. This is what happens when the cattle are removed. That's just cattle that was creating that damage. That's only 2 years difference between those images. So enhancing biodiversity credits and carbon credits. What Forest and Bird is saying at the national level is for people in the future, when we're drawing up policy for biodiversity credits and carbon credits, that private landowners will need to have them as designated SNAs, because we need to have a national way of dealing with this. So yeah, it doesn't matter whether we're talking to the Timaru District Council or South, and we're saying all the same things so that there can be a coordinated effort. Because what we need is integrity in the system, and having SNAs as one of the kind of baseline way of understanding this is going to be a useful way throughout the whole country of showing that there is some integrity in that system, as well as the follow-up that we'll need in terms of carbon measurements. Okay, Manuka. Now, when the first proposals for SNAs came up, and there was everyone who got one got the thing in the mail that said, "Oh, look, this is an SNA on your place." That was a desktop study, and in the proposal it says any threatened species must be considered an SNA. Now, at that time, myrtle rust had just come into the country, and so the scientists have put all the myrtle species, including all the different Manuka and Kānuka kohikatua species, on that list. I've been talking to the scientists, and there's a revision of all the threatened plants in the country. It'll be coming out in the next few months, and most Manuka and Kānuka will be removed from that because myrtle rust isn't impacting them as much. And so, in terms of what does and doesn't get designated SNA, as in what is a threatened species, that will change the dynamic around those areas that are mostly Manuka and Kānuka. So, can you see where I'm going with this? So that's going to change the intense friction perhaps around those issues. But that's not to say that areas of Manuka and Kānuka are not important, because up here we have all sorts of rare things hidden. This is one of our geckos. There's high endemism wooden geckos up here. So there's one that lives only between here, Hokianga and Kaitaia. There's others in lots of small places. So just because it's Manuka and Kānuka doesn't mean that it's kind of rubbish or whatever. And in the rules, you know, if Manuka or Kānuka is under 10 years old, it can be removed. But I don't know if people can tell how old things are. People often go, "Oh, it's just, we'll go and clear that." And what we've seen is a reaction against those initial proposals for people clearing SNAs using drones and helicopters to spray areas to just wipe them out, because they couldn't see that there was an alternative in terms of biodiversity credits or carbon credits, and thinking that they were being made to do things. What else have we got? Oh yeah, there's all sorts of stuff in these areas. Some amorous Cody snails. That's a giraffe weevil. If you don't know what's there, I just find there is such a loss of knowledge about forests, and it's not people's faults. It's just what's happened to people over 150 years, that people don't even know what they're looking at. I speak on marae all around the far north, and it's such a tragic situation now where often people can't name more than 10 native trees. And so to be able to make informed decisions about land use, whether it's putting a whare in there or papakaina development or whatever, I think there's a koha towards those kind of things. There needs to be an ecological report so people can factor in those things, because if you don't know, you don't know, and it's not fair for people even coming up with proposals. Come on. Yep. So in those, that's what I was going to mention. There were lots of areas in the far north in the 1960s that was farmed, and now all state forest between Paihia, Otoa, that kind of area. That if you look at those White's aviation photos of the 1960s, it's nearly all grass. And that forest now has kiwi and bats and all sorts of amazing things coming up through it. That's rat control, kahikatea seedlings coming up in terms of land maintenance. And in terms of enhancement, if we're looking to a future of the north, rather than just kind of doing the bare bones, we should be looking to a future where we have massive plots of kukupa again. The Whakaretion of Rangitikei district, which has a lot less forest than we do here, we can have quite a different kind of future. These are kukupa feeding in clover in September, bottom of Crimea. So rather than trying to do the minimal, we should be having a vision of the future that is resilient, brings back biodiversity, it brings back people's relationship with nature, and has a vision of abundance. So we're asking you to not hold the line so that there's no SNA loss during the next period of negotiations as an interim measure. Yeah, that's most of what I've got to say. Kia ora.
Yeah, kia ora. Thank you very much for that presentation, Mr. Agent Mercer. It was quite sobering, but very educational, and I think your message was quite clear to me. I'll see if any of the other panel members have any specific questions for you.
No questions. You said it was your first appearance in a hearing. You've actually both of you on audio visual at our first session.
Oh, true.
Just so you know, it's not forgotten.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah, I've aged since then.
So have I.
Any other questions?
Kia ora. Thank you for that presentation, and I appreciate the imagery as well of what was and what you can achieve by exclusion of stock and stuff like that. So thank you for showing us that context. As you mentioned, you do presentations or kōrero, maraes and wānanga and stuff, and as you say, not necessarily some of the hokainga are aware of what those historical resources were in Ēnahi and stuff like that. So Kaumātua may do, but those are slowly dwindling.
Mm.
But you made mention around, in particular, papakainga. So that's, a lot of whenua Māori is either vegetated 100% or quite a lot of portions. And so some of the home people are wanting to get whānau back so that they can do their own papakainga and development. And you made mention about ecological reports are quite useful and supportive. What can be a hindrance is the costs for ecological reports and stuff. So having that, having that sort of requirement, there are criteria that need to be assessed in regards to stuff. Just that cost prohibitive sometimes can put off some of the hukainga or whānau that are wanting to come back as well.
Mm. Oh yeah, I totally understand that, and maybe that needs some creative thinking about how that's done and how we do that, because I think it's really useful information. And also, in that context, I've been thinking about, I know the request is ka hoki ngā whenua ki a mātou, return the land to us, and so over, and we know, and there's lots of low-lying areas of papakainga, like at Waitaruki, those people are going to have to move, and there's going to be dockland returned, and so those big decisions are going to have to be made, and it's not a long time off, it's going to be very soon and in our lifetimes. So I think as there has been that return of Te Reo Māori during my lifetime, which has been a phenomenal effort, I think what we're seeing now is the return of the relationship with nature and those resources and those stories of joining the dots together, and that will happen as people are on the land. But there also needs to be that information to join the dots. I presented a wānanga Ōtangaroa 2 weeks ago. It was a taio wānanga from people across the north. Matua Tohi Ashby and Mike Smith and other people were presenting, and it was really interesting in that kind of environment how people go, oh, I didn't know that bit, oh, I didn't know that bit, and people are starting to join the jigsaw pieces together. So yeah, I think moving forward, enabling information is useful, rather than saying, no, you can't do this or that. It's difficult on whenua Māori, I totally get that. But when people get a buzz out of knowing that there's geckos there, for example, it doesn't mean necessarily no, it means coming up with a creative solution. It may be, okay, we build gecko houses and we make sure we're doing rat control. So that we can build our whare there, so we can have the coexistence. So it's about thinking broader. Yeah.
And Mātauranga Māori as well, I think, is part of that process. I saw I was assuming it was a Northern Rata that was in Loom as opposed to a Puhu Te Kawa, one. So it's all that tohu that's out in the Ngāhere and Wana that many of our people do know in regards to the condition of the environment that they're living in. So thank you.
Okay.
I appreciate that.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you. I mean, we're in quite a dynamic and challenging environment when it comes to SNAs. There are certain powers that the council can have, and there are certain things that we can recommend to the council as our role as a hearing panel. But we're in a situation where we've also got some direction and control coming from the central government, particularly with regards to how SNAs are managed and protected. So we're interested in ways that you can assist us, and certainly recommendations that we could potentially make to the council about how we transition through this interim period. And I suspect that's probably coming up in your submissions and solutions, but I think you've laid some really good groundwork in terms of what's at stake and what the opportunities are. John, thanks. Would you have a question?
Yeah, I just had a question, thanks again, Andy. Just in terms of one of the points that's been raised about the cost of ecological reports from suitably qualified ecologists, also the cost of a resource consent, for people that can't leave against their land, can't take out a mortgage. The cost of the ecologist and the resource consent, is upwards of $10,000. So you can see it's quite prohibitive in terms of cost for someone to even put a spade in the ground. Is there any wording that you could suggest around a permitted baseline amount or permitted baseline criteria that you think might be a balance between allowing land use activities but within a framework that doesn't, take up the requiring to get a resource consent or an ecologist?
Maybe
just some feedback. Maybe
my instinct is to say we should talk about that and get back to you.
Yeah.
To be cautious, but I also think maybe a different approach might be useful as well, which is having like a day on the whenua with ecologists. And so it could be written up as a report, but actually going and looking and because maybe that's another approach as well. But maybe we should get back to you about that and put some more thought into it because I get what you're saying.
Another question. So you had signalled you do a lot of data capturing as in rainfalls over the past 5 years and stuff. Do you find that when you may have Wānanga or Kōrero with Marais or others, that they do that sort of thing as well? Because I think that monitoring and measuring over time is quite useful.
I think there's all sorts of different measurements being taken. Like at the moment within the Doubtless Bay catchment, there is dissolved oxygen levels being measured for 3 of the major tributaries, which is part of a huge project, but not necessarily rainfall. That will just be people's individual, as far as I know, but I suppose we will have a database, but I'm not quite sure. People just go, oh, the road's out again. Do we need to call the council and make sure we can get through?
Okay, well, thank you very much for your first ever evidence presentation. It was pretty good start. You've set yourself quite a high bar now. Thanks again. There might be some further questions as we go through that may be better directed to you. So I hope you'll stick around.
Well, thank you, Commissioners. My turn to address you, and you'll have seen that I've submitted some written legal submissions.
Yes.
And I would obviously encourage you to read those if you haven't done already. I don't propose to just read through them today. I'll try to talk to them and obviously do my best to answer any questions that you may have.
Yes. I'll start off with a question for you. I mean, have you read the legal opinion of Council's Solicitor, Mr. Shaw?
I did read that.
Yes. So okay. So
I must read that.
so we've read them too, and he presented this, the council's position. He's the council's. So we are guided by his legal advice in terms of what we can do and what we're obliged to do, and how we respond, and what's likely to happen in terms of legislation. He appraised us on the bill currently before Parliament, and that if things follow its normal parliamentary progression and the government still has a majority, then that will be passed probably towards the end of this year. And so I think the message that came out of that was expect that legislation to pass. Obviously, we're not going to be releasing any interim decisions. We're going to be doing interim deliberations, but not recommendation reports. So I suspect we'll be concluding these hearings towards the end of next year, and those recommendation reports will be coming out in the new year following that, 2026. Seems like a long time away, but we'll get there sooner than we think. So we're operating in quite a period of flux. And we know, I think we're expecting the legislation to be passed. Stranger things have happened, but all things being equal, that's probably where we are in the statutory sense. And so that's the interim period that we're sort of coming to grips with. So any advice you can give us on how we manage that process whilst keeping true to the values of SNA? I don't think any party sort of wants to diminish SNA or doesn't want to protect them. It's just that there are a range of ways about how you go about achieving that.
Yes, obviously the main policy direction at the moment is in the National Policy Statement on Indigenous Biodiversity, and as you've been saying, that is an area that is likely to see some change. And my understanding of the advice that's been given to Council is that the recommendations in the Section 42A report in terms of not being in a position now to fully implement the MPSIB as it stands. Now, I understand that advice, and I can see that that's going to guide you. Forest and Bird does maintain, of course, that really the most effective and efficient way to to do what we need to do in terms of really protecting these significant natural areas is by identifying them, mapping them, putting in place appropriate provisions which guide activities in those areas. So that is, Forest and Bird maintains that position, and hopefully, I'm certainly hopeful that things aren't going to change that much.
Well, we're in this funny position, isn't it? So even if we sort of say, well, it's not legislation yet, and if we recommend to the council that they actually do map various scenarios, it seems to us that by the time we get to make that recommendation, it may be taken out of our hands.
Well, of course, there is of course also the Act itself. So the Section 60 of the Act says you do need to protect significant natural areas. So even if the MPSIB is changed, there is still this underlying prohibition.
And that's what I was saying. I think everyone agrees that the actual purpose of the Act hasn't changed. It's the methods that are actually being changed. And I think one of the other issues the council is wrestling with, and we're wrestling with how they're wrestling with it, is that what I'm getting from the 42A reports is SNA mapping is probably the best method to identify and then be on measures and to protect them. But it requires an enormous amount of resource. And it seems to me that you've got a number of national policy statements. You know, you can say this about the policy statement of highly productive land. It requires local and regional councils to do an enormous amount of mapping to accurately protect a range of values. But there's no resourcing that comes with it. It's just meant to be magically, those resources are meant to be found within those local authorities themselves. Then you get Northland as an example, which is the second largest territorial district in New Zealand, with one of the lowest rating bases per hectare, and and markedly lower average incomes. So where's that resourcing going to come from, even if you mandate a local authority to do it? It's a really big issue.
I see.
We can't ignore that.
And I can see that some of those issues are heightened in Northland for the reasons that you've said. And of course, you'll be aware that there are lots of local authorities around the country who have conducted and completed this exercise. I'm not saying that it's easy, but it is possible. And my understanding is that it's a process that's been going on in the far north for some time. And I did look in the operative plan, and I saw that there's provision in there for an SNA committee and for ecologist reports. And I imagine the council has been building up a large file somewhere, sitting in the office somewhere that they can look at when they need to, in terms of consenting perhaps. And of course, there's also all of the wildlands work that's gone on. So there is already a large body of information. I think, I'm not privy to all of the information the council has, but it seems to me that the council must have a pretty good idea now about where the potential SNAs are. And really, we would like just to urge you, the council, to make provisions which ensure that those areas aren't chipped away at in the meantime. For whatever reason, through development or even through just bad decision making by people, and perhaps misunderstandings around what's happening. Dean talked a little bit about people perceiving as a threat to their land ownership. These are real issues which the council is aware of. And again, I think we do need to have some more sort of creative thinking about how to change the mindset and change the conversation and try to get people on board with that. But in the meantime, we need strong interim measures which can ensure that we're not losing what it is that we're ultimately hoping to protect.
Just a question about enabling, as you talked about, encouraging. There is a policy in the subdivision chapter that, encourages subdivision provisions and protection and enhancement of Indigenous biodiversity. Do you have any suggestions of enabling policies that incentivise activities, as you're suggesting, because...
Well, there's the subdivision policies, which can be a bit of a double-edged sword, but they can work, they can be effective. I know that there's a similar policy in Ōmāpere. Then, of course, there's all of the financial potential incentives, which can be at least sort of enabled at a policy level. Dean spoke about the carbon credits, biodiversity credits, and it's gone off my head. But those sort of, and also I suppose financial assistance would be the main one. I appreciate the council doesn't have endless resources, but if the council's part of its function is to maintain biodiversity in the district. If there are resources that are available to help people to when they want to develop their land, to actually make a proper assessment of what's there and help them in that way, if that's something that could be sort of enabled at a policy level, And again, that's something that we would support. So helping people to make the right decisions.
Yeah, and in your legal submissions, you're looking at a number of changes to the provisions, and I think this sort of goes along with your story about holding the line. And I think you've got some particular submissions relating to permitted vegetation clearance.
Yes.
And I think that sort of fits into the theme of the earlier presentation of Live a Legal Way. Is that sort of the main thrust of the actual specific things that you're urging us to do?
That is, I would say that's true. That's really where it sort of the rubber hits the road. It's where it's
PhD.
Rule 3.
And has practiced in the UK.
So I think yes, it is, yes. And so
So you're concerned that in this interim period, whilst we sit at what happens
yes,
with the SNA, is that the rules and the policies that support the rules are a bit too permissive? Is that the thrust of your
that is the thrust of it. And also, yeah, that's the thrust of it. And also we're concerned around the use of what we would see as really quite weak proxies for Indigenous biodiversity. So this idea of a remnant forest is one which I would say is an example of a weak proxy. It's not really clear what it means, I would suggest, or if it does mean, let's say it means what it says it means, which is that it's forest that's never been clear felled. There's probably very little of that around.
It's not I don't think it's a very good definition in terms of what needs to be protected. We've been rolling around ideas about how to rephrase things, because if it's a forest that hasn't been clear felled, really there's only a few areas that hasn't had extensive logging, but nearly all other areas have been logged. So does that mean
they're all remnant?
yeah, it's all remnant, okay. So the remnants that have been logged, some have been logged and burnt 3 times, some have been logged and left to recover since World War II. But there's all these different things going on, and there's all sorts of things in them because of the different amounts of the tax that they've had on them. But if there was a line drawn, and this is dangerous territory now, when we get into drawing lines, this is what's so difficult about making rules, isn't it?
Line's got to go somewhere.
Yeah, but you know, if you're starting to eat into things that are more than 50 years old, I think that's a real problem. But you could, I mean, there's biodiversity values and things that are over 10 years old, depending on where it is. But particularly, you know, forests that have Rewiriwa, Tarai, and species like that are telling you that those areas haven't been burned. And they are the last bits, last of the originals. And that's really important not to eat into those, rather than some what has regenerated out of grasslands. But even so, I'd be very cautious about that.
So I mean, there's a lot of, with this whole issue of remnant forest, there's a lot of areas which have native vegetation values in them. They have potentially tremendous potential, but they're sitting sort of on the medium to low value scale. And obviously there needs to be intervention of some sort to make them of SNA value. The challenge for us is a rule framework that encourages the enhancement of those values. But we are a little bit, I won't say hamstrung, but restricted by how we can require enhancement in the rule framework. And normally it's usually done by incentivization through subdivision.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
as the incentive to protect and enhance.
Well, I mean, we're talking here about the permissive activities, aren't we? So, yes, it's sort of the other side of that.
Yes.
And yeah, we're certainly very interested in ways that the council could encourage landowners to enhance biodiversity.
Yes.
But in terms of the sort of permissive activities, we also just want to make sure that those are set at a level which not not only protects biodiversity, but also I think sends the right message, particularly where the council is not identifying those areas that are SMAs. And it doesn't really matter in my submission what you call them all that much. I mean, I know that the bill is proposing that, areas of, SNA is or something, whatever, or however they are referred to. I think that's some language along those lines. But I mean, those areas exist, and no matter what you call them. So, I think now in the section 42A report proposes to move away from talking about SNAs to sort of a longer form of words, which is taken from the regional policy statement. I mean, I've talked about those as significant ecological areas, which is also the term that's used down in the Auckland Unitary Plan. So, there's two different sort of conversations going on here, I think. One is to really make sure that we protect those areas which do meet the criteria in the regional policy statement. Appendix 5, isn't it? And that is a core key concern for us. And then there's a sort of a slightly separate conversation around, how you enhance and improve the biodiversity, which doesn't quite meet those criteria at the moment.
I've just been thinking about this. So you can get carbon credits for growth that has come back in forests since 1990. That's a system that's already up and running, and people are getting a few hundred, well, I'm not quite sure how many hundred per hectare a year. So that's from land that was ground zero since 1990. In the future, we're trying to work out ways for pre-1990 native forests to get that. And the complexity around that is around measurements and having the right technical instruments. So I'm talking to lots of different scientific bodies about that too, because what we have up here is really different to beach forests and wild. So that's a hard nut to crack, but we'll get there. And so there will be, so that in terms of incentives, if you've got post-1990s forests that you can get carbon credits for, then you've already got an incentive there in terms of enhancement and the money going back in. We haven't yet got it for pre-1990s, but we will have that program in the future. So it's kind of like, it's the flux that you're talking about. We know we'll have those things in place, but we've got to aim for that kind of future in how we phrase things. But people are destroying things in the meantime without realising that there's going to be future value.
Well, I'm just sort of thinking off the cuff there. If those carbon credits are available to landowners, do they have to map them in order to get them?
Yeah,
I would think you would, wouldn't you? If you're going to say, I've got X amount of post-19, so isn't that the incentive for others to do accurate mapping in order to get the credit? And maybe it's a process upon which that mapping gets shared. At the moment, it's like, oh, crikey, we can't afford to do, no one can afford to do the mapping. Don't force me to do it. I'm a landowner who's struggling to run a viable farm. But if the incentivisation is through the carbon credit process, then maybe the incentivisation is enough to do the accurate mapping.
There's also mapping that
There's obviously opportunities for partnerships there.
Yeah. There's mapping through QE2 Trust and through Ngā Whenua Pahui as well. So they're not separate. There's a lot of mapping going on. It seems like there's a lot.
It just seems like it would need a bit of coordination.
Yeah. And in terms of carbon credits, biodiversity credits, we can see a future where SNAs line up with Kawanata and QE2 Trust shows that there's integrity going on, there's accountability and things like that, so we just try to line all those things up.
Yeah, so I'll bring on one story. So, yes, questions from the panel?
Just a quick question around, so carbon credits and biodiversity credits are different. Because I know I'm aware of Māori Whenua and corporation farmlands, where you do have Ngā forests, but From what I've heard in conversations, there's not so much an incentive to replant, so to say, steep slopes with ngahere. It's instead other species, be it redwoods, eucalypts,
Yes.
pines.
Well, that's the policy setting for carbon credits and unfortunately the forestry corporations have got ahead of the game. There will be blowback, particularly with pines and plants. It depends if you're trying to get fast money or in there for much longer term stuff. Sorry, we tried to get ahead of it, but we got steamrolled by the corporations.
Thank you. I just want to clarify.
Thanks for all your presentations today. I just want to make sure we've got time today to go through the actual specifics of what you're recommending to change to the policies and the rules. So if we've got time to run through that, that'd be helpful.
I have actually lost track of time a little bit. I'm sorry, I don't know where we are.
We're at 10 o'clock and just, Robert, we have got Mariana as well before the break.
Yes. You set out at 33 the specific points you're seeking, which I thought later on would be a useful one for us to run through, but as Peter says, it would be useful to hear your comments on those now. Yeah.
All right. So, I mean, I don't know whether you want me to take you through all of those. I focused in the written submissions on the Indigenous biodiversity chapter, because this seems an Indigenous characteristic. So I've recognised the fact that Council is, aiming to implement the MPSIB through a future plan change. I've suggested that it would nonetheless, even if that is to be the chosen route, but nonetheless it would be helpful to keep some policy direction in this plan around, mapping, identification. There's some in the operative plan. It would be a big gap in policy in my submission if there was nothing there in the plan around that. And of course that should be the intention of supporting a future plan change as opposed to sort of interfering with it in some ways. Something that we'll need to grapple with, but it shouldn't be too difficult. In the sense that assuming that this is going to happen but in a longer time frame, which seems to be at the moment the assumption we're working on, then the identification and mapping will need to happen at some point. So I'd urge you to keep some provision in the plan for that. Now.
Is that policy one?
That is, that would be policy one, which was removed. And the recommendation was for that to be removed. In the second policy.
That's not set out in your legal submissions.
That's at,
was it in your original?
Yeah, it's in the legal submission. So it's in the original submission. Well, this is something that's changed in terms of the recommendation that's now being made to Council to remove that direction, the policy direction. So that's the recommendation in the section 42A report. So that's something that I have responded to in the legal submissions, and I've suggested that something should be in the plan around.
Paragraph 12 talks about nothing management preferences already in the plan.
Yeah. So, and paragraph 8, it would be appropriate to provide policy direction in the PDP for the work that needs to be done by Council. And then it goes on. So that's really the first section of the submissions from paragraph 7 to 12. Where I've talked about the policy direction for identifying SMEs. Then we have policies 2 and 3, which are generally supported. In my submission, they do a much better job of giving effect to the main sort of policies, being the coastal policy statement, and also the MPSIB and the regional policy statement, which we mustn't forget. Of course, the Council must give effect to that. So that wording that's now in those policies is a lot better, I would suggest. I've suggested that a few changes could be made just to really align fully with the regional policy statement and the coastal policy statement. I suppose the what has been sort of attempted is to summarise those matters, and I would suggest, I know that there's resistance to simply sort of repeating higher order policy in the district plan, but sometimes it does make sense, particularly where you've got these quite sort of specific matters, for example, in the postal policy statement. You can just set those out, I would suggest, in the district plan, and make sure that nothing's missed. But overall, that support the recommendations for changes in section 42A report. Policy IB P4. Yes, this is around the use of the word significant adverse effects, and now my understanding is of the advice that's been given to council is that while it isn't going to be practicable to fully implement the MPSIB, nonetheless, where council can implement the MPSIB in the context of this plan change, it should do that. And of course, that is the direction in the policy statement itself. You need to do this as soon as practicable. And so I think I've talked about paragraphs 14 to 17 about this, and in particular, clause 3.16 of the MPSIB. And my understanding, again, from reading the section 42A report, is that the intention is to give effect to this clause of the policy statement through the plan. And it's the clause in the MPSIB which talks about Indigenous biodiversity outside SNAs. So there are two parts to this. And the first is that if there's any significant adverse effects of an activity, then it needs to be managed by applying the effects management hierarchy. And I believe that is of course captured in policy 4. But in my submission, what's missing is the sort of second limb to clause 3.16, which is that all other adverse effects of any activities that may adversely affect Indigenous biodiversity that is outside an SNA, other than Indigenous biodiversity on specified Māori land, must be managed to give effect to the objective and policies of this national policy statement. So this is effects that aren't significant. Then you need to turn back to the objective of the MPSIB, which is essentially to maintain Indigenous biodiversity. So Forest and Birds ask for a clear policy direction. But, this is the council's function, and this is what the council is aiming to do, is to maintain Indigenous biodiversity generally, not just to sort of reduce effects on significant, or avoid significant effects, mitigate significant effects, but to maintain it.
That makes sense.
I'm conscious that we've got another submission.
Yes.
We need to squeeze in the
Yeah.
And I thought, so I think it's going actually through the submissions.
No, that's fine. And
I think we've got the clear distance of where the society is coming from. And, I've read, I think we've all had at least some reading of these legal submissions.
Yeah.
Certainly, we will take your specific recommendations and suggestions for wordings into account when we do our interim deliberations, which will be shortly.
I'm grateful for that indication. Thank you.
And so the message I'm sending to you is, whilst I don't think we need to go through the detail, certainly understand where the thrust of your policy recommendations are coming from.
Perhaps if I would just at a very high level.
Really specifically.
So at a high level, I think when we're looking at specific permitted activities, and I know you did mention earlier, the council, I do understand the panel's in a difficult situation here in terms of balancing these.
But we are interested in what we can do.
Yes. Yes. But I'm afraid my submission would be that there may not be an easy answer, and that really, when it comes to the specific permitted activities, they need to be set at a level which will be appropriate within these significant ecological areas, at least in the interim, until we can assess, map them and decide what to do about them. In that context, Forest and Brook had some reservations around the methods that were adopted in the notified version, in particular around the voluntary nature of scheduling the SNAs. But having some kind of a threshold, a trigger for an ecological assessment does seem to me to be, one way around this kind of an impasse, because I can see that it could be difficult for the council to treat everywhere as if it were an SNA.
I think your legal submissions are well set out for us to go back through them when we're doing our, more intensive deliberations. So it's good that they are presented in that way. So thanks.
Thank you. Well, I'll leave it there then.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the first presentation, which is again very informative. It was quite sobering, but it ended on a positive note of what we can achieve. So thank you very much for that. And echoing Commissioner Larson's comments, your legal submissions are actually clear. I certainly understand the basis upon where the formulation of the recommendations are coming from. So thanks again for your evidence. Great. Thank you. Safe travels back home.
Thank you. Stay and listen to the
Yes.
the next one.
I think there's a very effective photo there that shows two people with the possum's face and the eyes sort of makes it look like a garlic tree. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Okay, so we have Mariana Fenn.
Yes.
Would you like to come up to the table, Ms. Fenn? How much time do you think you would like to present?
I'll try and make it as brief as possible.
No, I don't want to constrain you too much. What I'm going to say is we have got a little bit of flexibility.
Okay.
We don't need to have, well, our morning tea break can be extended a little bit. I just wanted to know, how much time would you like?
I think I can probably do like 10, 15 minutes.
Oh, well, we've got 20,
Depending
so
on
why don't you take 20 minutes?
Okay, yeah, I think that would be sufficient. So kia ora, my name is Mariana Fenn. I live near Honganui.
Now, so you're speaking directly to your submission? And you've got some, and did you have some evidence?
I don't have evidence to present, no. I'm
Okay.
speaking to my submission.
So directly to
and-
your submission. Yes,
And
well,
responding to the section 42A report and the legal counsel
No, I've got-
position.
I've got your submission up here.
Okay, cool. I have, I'm limited to sort of being concerned about the Indigenous biodiversity aspects of the plan. And I had a hand in putting some input into the forest and bird submission. So there's a lot of similarity between the stuff that I put forward and the stuff in the forest and bird submission. So I'll try and avoid overlap on that. But I did my own personal submission, because there were some points that I wanted to make sure got included. And I guess I'll just start quickly, just a very quick comment in terms of the significant natural area mapping. I understand the position, but I do think that council should try and find a way forward to include some kind of mapping with the information that is held. And debate that it's only going to be an interim measure, so that could kind of assuage some of the concerns by landowners. It's not forever. This is just the holding pattern. In terms of the mapping and the cost, I kind of query the ecological assessment cost that's put forward, the 3,000 to 6,000. I think that certainly in the interim period and at a first pass, it could probably be done a lot more extensively than that, and with support from council to take the cost off landowners, like a council ecologist who can come and do a quick pass. I think there's new technology like drones. I've personally got a mapping drone that you can send out and do kind of canopy surveys. So like what Dean was saying with the variety and rewa and these key species that are indicators, it would not be expensive to map quickly and identify areas with those species. And you could probably do it even with the satellite imagery, and even possibly with AI technology like PEX 4D. There's some AI stuff that's already available for analysing digital imagery. So I encourage that, but I won't labour that anymore because we've covered that already. In the context of the specific provisions and relief, Objective 2, I put in a comment saying basically there should be enhancement to biodiversity added That wasn't supported in the section 42A report, but I think it is really important, and that in the context of adding resilience for climate change, which was supported as being needed to be incorporated into the plan, maintenance is not enough. If we maintain ourselves at the brink of ecosystem collapse and extinctions, they will happen. We have to push forward and try to build back to be in the best position we can for what's coming. So I stand by that submission. I also think I made a submission requesting consideration of mapping and provision for environments of ecosystems that are really vulnerable to climate change. And in that, I was thinking mostly of like coastal systems, like wetlands, which we saw from Dean's presentation are almost all gone. The biggest one being like Kaimomo, and with sea level rise, that is going to get squeezed against the farmland next door. And if the farmer can keep defending his paddocks and the sea keeps rising, that ecosystem will disappear. But if we look ahead in time, see what is coming, and make provision for setbacks and coastal retreat in the same way that we do for people, then those species have a better chance of being able to move back in the landscape and continue. The planning officer sort of wasn't in support of that and sort of noted potential cost implications. But I submit, the council may well be put to like compensate beach bat owners for their $1 million homes that they shouldn't have bought knowing climate change was coming, and the cost of some farmland in remote areas is not high. So I don't really accept that cost should be the final answer to saying this should be considered. I think, yeah, it's a good idea, it should happen. In relation to, so moving into the policies, policy 4, I think there should be a net gain. The council should insist on net gain where offsetting is being considered. And that's consistent with my position that we should be aiming for enhancement, not just maintenance. And I accept that with regard to compensation, as opposed to offsetting, net gain is not exactly possible, but we should still be seeking, where we're at those activities, to try and have compensation at a level that is going to add something back.
So this is effectively the effects hierarchy, isn't it?
It is, yeah, but I just think at the level where we get to...
mitigate, offset, compensate.
Yeah, exactly. And that when we're at that lower end, I think we should be looking to get some benefits from it. If we're at that level where it's like, it's an activity that is going to have these effects that can't be avoided, remedied, or mitigated. In relation to policy 5, I had a submission about unreasonable restrictions on existing farming practices. I don't know exactly how it should be implemented, but I think there's a lot of improvement that could be made to farming practices, and that we don't want to enshrine protection for the way things are when it's not working for us. So that was why I put that in. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how that should be addressed, but I guess kind of flagging that, and in terms of definitions of farming, making sure that they don't enable practices that might need to be phased out in the coming years. Moving on to policy 6. So I advocated for putting in, and Forest and did too, nature-based solutions as being encouraged, and that was the planner sort of had issues with that as being too vague. I'd suggest to put in something more specific there, like encouraging and supporting creation of wetlands and afforestation to mitigate effects of climate change, drought, floods, etc. So there might be a rephrasing of that, but I think it is an important thing to kind of focus people's minds on the potential of nature-based solutions. And I support keeping the focus on, with relation to subclause A, on ecological assessments, but having them be done in a cost-effective way that's supported by council, and possibly not the $3,000 to $6,000 version, but something lighter that at least enables landowners and the council to get an idea of what there is. So going somewhere between nothing and the perfect solution. So enabling something there. And then these ecological reports, you might need to reassess them when the national policy statement on Indigenous biodiversity comes into effect. But I bet in a lot of cases you wouldn't have to. So it would be laying the groundwork for what would be done later when, if indeed the council decides to sort of push off the identification then. I don't think it will be work that is wasted. I think it, you'd be ahead of the game if you were starting on that process now. In relation to a request to have rates relief, sort of non-regulatory incentives included. I think the comment from the planner was that that's outside the district plan. And I agree that actually saying you will get rates relief is out, but I think it's important to have it in so that people can see on the face of the plan that it's being considered and that would be supported. So when you get your land identified as an SNA or there's extra measures put in, you can see that there's an intention for a further process by which that contribution to the environment will be recognised through rates relief, through whatever it is.
In a similar vein, with the evidence we've received previously, there's this concept of carbon and biodiversity credits.
Yeah.
That would also be a mechanism.
Totally. And I think it should be in the plan that the council was thinking like that and intending to try and find ways to make it work for landowners. Because otherwise it just looks like the stick. And there are carrots that you can't give in the plan, but you can include a commitment to pursuing them on behalf of landowners in the district.
So are you suggesting that the plan might list a number of non-regulatory methods that are available that don't fit within the district plan so much, but identify that they are possibly available?
Identify council's commitment to pursuing them as and when they become available in whatever form they materialise.
The national policy statements are created from central government, and there's also new legislation that our council has that, well, I think it was 2 years ago, so unutilised land doesn't pay rates. Central government land doesn't pay rates. And in terms of the people that do pay rates, it's very high in our district. Is there any feedback you've had from any central government agencies or parties that they're willing to pay for the legislation that they're creating?
You personally know that might be a question for Tim and
well, just some feedback that unfunded mandates on an area that's very poor, very large, it doesn't receive income from the people creating all this legislation. It feels like you're going under because where you're supposed to get all this resource, people that don't have any money are being told to pay for it all. And they're already paying for this process now. So I guess maybe that's some feedback that someone's always got to pay, and it'll be great. There's always great incentives, but there has to be someone that pays for it somehow.
Yes, I suppose one of the risks you run is if rates release is a primary to incentivise, those rates are needed to do other things like parks and reserves and infrastructure and stuff. So I suppose there's a balancing that needs to happen, isn't there? That's why I seem to be particularly interested in this whole idea of carbon credits, because that is a source of income that doesn't come from the ratepayer, free the central government. And that it's actually a market solution. So maybe that provides an opportunity.
In the context of the rates consideration though, if these areas are protected and a lot of those significant natural areas, etc., and are in the upper parts and catchments, and that reduces the impact of flooding and stuff, that reduces the impact on your infrastructure downstream that the rates are paying for. So I think it does pay for itself in some respects, but not completely. I totally accept that.
And just to give context, so our district compared to Auckland, so Auckland's probably almost 100% rainfall, and it's a much smaller geographical area and it's a higher density population. So in our area, the number of people actually paying, when you do rates relief, that doesn't mean that you reduce the amount of money you get. It means that the people that are paying more to compensate the people that aren't paying. So I don't know, maybe at a regional level where we're all of Northland, right, going down to Whangarei, which is actually a city, would have more scope to have more cash flow. But yeah, I think the only solution is really to incentivise it maybe from central government coffers for the budgets. But lots of feedback if there's
I mean, I'd
conversation.
encourage the district council to be pushing central government for that as well.
Yeah, definitely.
You can, yeah.
Definitely, there's been some marches about that, yeah.
This is what we want to do.
Sorry, we sort of digressed a little bit there, so.
No, that's good. I know, sorry, I'm charging through. I had some notes after reading all of the sort of comments. So moving on to policy 9, which was about managing pets and pests. And I can understand why the recommendation from the planning officer was to take out the requirement to manage pests, because that could be pretty onerous and difficult to enforce, and etc. I wanted livestock to be added there in terms of an owner's responsibility to manage, not just pets. I can speak to my own catchment where there are unfenced livestock roaming everywhere in and out of bush areas, big herds of goats that are not fenced, that are having massive ecological impacts. The Northland Pest Management Pathway, or whatever it is, lists feral goats, but it doesn't list domestic goats, where the issue is that landowners are not fencing and containing their stock. And there's also feral cattle, which is a massive problem in our catchment, and that's not listed in the Northern Regional Pest Management Plan. I understand there's like the Fencing Act, which puts out requirements for kind of containing your animals, but that's more like in between neighbours. So if you're worried about landscape level effects from roaming domestic stock, you've got nowhere to go. And my experience with raising it is it's sort of dealt with like a lost property issue as opposed to an ecological issue. So having something in the plan, yeah, I guess I've only looked at the policy level, but yeah, having something in the plan that adds that requirement to manage your livestock and its effects on flora as well as fauna, because the two things are interrelated. So the planning officer was proposing to take out flora and just have effects on fauna, just on animals, but pets. And if livestock were included, they have effects on flora, and that has effects on the animals as well and their habitat where they live. Moving on to Rule 1, PER 1, the removal of dead trees. It's really important, I think, that dead trees are seen as a critical part of the forest ecosystem. They provide habitat and they're essential in terms of nutrient cycling. And I feel like in the past there's been this attitude that a dead tree or a wind-fallen tree is a resource to be harvested. With everything the way that it is, I don't think we can continue with that kind of attitude, and I think it opens the door for disturbance of really critical natural areas that should be left in that nutrient cycle that should be left. So a lot of our threatened species like bats and things rely on dead trees. And if we're going to enhance and maintain, enhance our biodiversity, bring back species, a lot of those species are going to be coming back. We'll need those dead trees. So there shouldn't be provision to remove from an SNA, but I guess it's a complicated discussion, but generally as a matter of principle, they should be left. And in the context of residential units clearing around them, if you're building a house and doing all of that, I just feel like it's not massively onerous to have a consent requirement for the vegetation clearance as well. I think there should be some kind of assessment if it's, and again, this is an SNA because I'm responding to the provisions. as proposed, but if it's a significant natural area, there absolutely should be a biodiversity assessment before you go ahead and clear your 1,000 metres squared, because it could be in one of those remnant Te Rāwhiti forests, really shade there, but you know, like you don't know where it is, and I just don't agree that it would be too onerous to put that, to include that in the assessment when you're already getting your building consent, and you know there'll be all sorts of triggers in the plan. And I think, yeah, that has potential to have a big impact on SNAs if it's allowed as a permitted activity with no oversight. With regard to, I think it's clause 9, the new fences. So the plan as proposed was allowing like 7 metres wide for a fence, so 3.5 metres on either side. You don't need 3.5 metres on either side of the fence. And if it's boundary fencing, that introduces as a permitted activity, you know, clearing massive swathes through potentially, you know, significant natural areas to establish boundary fencing. I just think it's excessive, and particularly if SNAs aren't going to be mapped, yeah, that doesn't need to be like that. That should be pared back to something that's reasonable. I think Dean touched on this, but with relation to clause 10, permitted clearing of vegetation less than 10 years old, I don't think a lot of people would be able to assess looking at something that age. I think 10 years is not precautionary enough. I think 5 years is reasonable, and if it's over 5, you know, and then you can have a consent. It's not saying you can't clear it, you just have to have somebody have a look at it. And I feel like 5 years is kind of a good sort of living memory. Yeah, because vegetation grows at really different rates in different contexts. So something might look like it's only maybe 10 years old, but it actually could be 50, 60 years old in marginal soils, and it could be really significant. So in relation to, the Indigenous vegetation clearance rules for PR1, yeah, I think the council needs to take if you're not going to map SNAs, then the rules on Indigenous vegetation clearance need to be really restrictive and strict to make sure that SNAs are not being chipped away at in the meantime. When I saw the council planning officer's recommendations for how to adjust those Indigenous vegetation clearance rules, initially I was happy until I saw that it wasn't every 5 years, it was every year. So it was like 5 times the amount. And the clearance rules are effectively allowing half of what would be allowed if SNAs were mapped, but SNAs are not mapped. So if you sort of start with that 5-year period as it was in the proposed plan, it's like 2,500 hectares in the rural production zone that could be cleared in the same amount of time. And I just don't think that compensates for not identifying where the SNAs are. I think it's too much risk. I'd be happy with what the planning officer recommended, but only if it was on a 5-year basis. So effectively a fifth of what is proposed, I think would be a better balance and would protect particularly future SNA areas that are smaller in size, and some of those could be really important. And that is quite restrictive, but I think if it was put forward as an interim measure, you know, that kind of eases it a little bit. So that was all my comments on the Indigenous biodiversity chapter. I just had a few points in the natural character chapter of the plan. I think with regard to, so in the objectives for natural character is mapped in the coastal environment, and I think it's crazy that it's not mapped inland. I think for consistency and for proper management of those areas, it should be mapped. And I don't think that it is that onerous to do that around lakes and rivers. And I think once you do that then, and this sort of relates back to where I was at the start of the Indigenous biodiversity chapter, like creating buffer zones, because we know that climate change is going to have impacts on wetlands and rivers and streams. And if you with those natural character areas mapped, and then you're thinking about buffer zones, you could design in things to ensure that those environments are protected in an uncertain future. And then with regard to policy 3, which was about Indigenous vegetation clearance, yeah, I support there was going to be a change to saying keeping that vegetation clearance to the minimum amount necessary. And I think that's really important. And that's it.
Very good. And
That's
look,
good.
you're around 5 minutes over, but that's fine.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's absolutely fine. Now, I just have one, I mean, I think your evidence is really clear. And so, and it's got a number of triggers to relook at what the 42A report says, so thanks for that. What I did miss was what was your background? You obviously got quite a lot of experience in this area. I just wanted to confirm again what your background was.
Yeah, so my background, I studied law and science with a focus on conservation ecology, biology, and then I practiced law for 5 years in a resource management context. So I worked as a junior on district and review hearings and such.
Right.
But I'm not coming here as a legal expert.
Yes, no, I understand.
It's my request in that level of analysis. So.
No, I accept that you're not representing as an expert or as a legal counsel.
Legal capacity, yeah.
But it was obvious to me that you've had extensive experience in this area, and I just wanted to understand what your background was. So thanks for that. I'll just quickly see if any other panel members have any questions. Any questions?
I'd just like a clarification, please, on your suggested wording for policy 6 and the Indigenous biodiversity chip. I missed writing that down. I thought you.
Policy 6, yes, so this was the nature-based solutions.
What was your?
When I wrote nature-based solutions, I was thinking about creation of wetlands and afforestation as the key points. I don't know if that would be, there may be other things you could add in there, but I just thought it is worth including, and maybe you could just reframe it so it's more specific and less vague.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your very focused and targeted presentation this morning.
Slightly rushed.
No, it's okay. No, thank you. It was very clear. Okay. Right. So we're going to be having our morning tea adjournment. We've got Luckmore Farms scheduled to commence at 10:50, but I think we're running about 10 minutes late. So are you happy to start your presentation at 11? Okay. Well, we'll adjourn till 11 o'clock, and feel free to make yourself up to the table here in that time.
Tea and coffee.
There's tea and coffee out in the room next door.
And we have got them online as well. Okay, cool, I'm stopping the recording.